St. Petersburg is the second largest city in Russia, after Moscow. 2002 census recorded population of the federal subject 4,661,219, or 3.21% of the total population of Russia. The city with its vicinity has an estimated population of about 6 million people. Ethnicity. The 2002 census recorded 22 ethnic groups of more than 2,000 persons each. The ethnic composition was Russian 84.72%, Ukrainian 1.87%, Belarusians 1.17%, Jewish 0.78%, Tatar 0.76%, Armenian 0.41%, Azeri 0.36%, Georgian 0.22%, Chavash 0.13%, Polish 0.10%, Finnish 0.08%, Korean 0.08%, German 0.08%, Moldovan 0.07%, Moldovan 0.07%, Uzbek 0.06%, Kazakh 0.06%, Ossetian 0.06%, Bashkir 0.05%, Tajik 0.05%, Estonian 0.05%, Karelian 0.05%, Lithuanian 0.6%, and many other ethnic groups of less than 2,000 persons each. 7.89% of the inhabitants declined to state their ethnicity. As of 2001, 41% of Petersburgers identified themselves as Russian Orthodox, another 21% called themselves Christians in general. Almost half of both groups were at the same time self-reported non-believers. The number of church parishioners of the Russian Orthodox Church are estimated as less than 5%. St. Petersburg has always been populated mostly by Russians, albeit with several sizable ethnic minorities, such as Germans, Ukrainians, Finns, and people from Eastern Europe, among others. In 1800, an estimated 200 to 300,000 lived in the city. After the emancipation of serfs in 1861, former serfs started arriving to the capital as workers, boosting population from 500,000 to 1,439.6 thousand recorded in the census of 1900. Population. Throughout the 3 centuries, the growth of St. Petersburg was accompanied by an increase in population of its surroundings, while the latter to the city were gradually incorporated into the city limits. From an administrative point of view, these suburbs comprised a few UEZDs adjacent to the city, holding an intermediate position between the gubernia as the largest unit in Russia and the city of Petersburg as its center. A known confusion between the St. Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad UEZD and 4 districts referred to as suburbs may sometimes lead to a discrepancy between the statistical data taken from different sources, especially considering the fact that a suburban Tsarskoye-Selsky UEZD was excluded from district statistics. In 1890 to 1891, the population figures for Petersburg crossed the boundary of 1 million. By 1900, the 38 plots comprising the city itself had a population of 1,248,122, while the 4 above-named suburban districts counted 191,491 people. In the 20th century, the city experienced 3 major depopulation trends. The first one began in 1916. In addition to the February Revolution, the sharp deterioration in food supplies in the first months of 1917 caused the flood of certain segments of population to the rural areas of Russia. In 1918, Petrograd without suburbs counted 1,179,256 persons, and in 1920 about 740,000. By the time mobilizations brought the remarkable preponderance of women over men, 100 to 72, not counting the troops. The demobilization after the end of the Civil War, the industrial revival which followed the promulgation of new economic policy, resumption of the old and opening a lot of new universities and especially colleges led to the increasing influx of population since 1921, in which younger generations formed a notable part. The first 5-year plans put the population growth upon the planned basis supported by propiska residential quotas introduced at the beginning of the 1930s. It should be noted that in the years of industrialization in the USSR, the influx of population was at the same time accompanied by the annual outflow of tens of thousands of college graduates and workers assigned to another locations of the country on the construction sites and in rural areas from where they came to study in Leningrad. The German minority in Petersburg began to extinguish at the end of the 19th century. This process accelerated in 1914 with the beginning of the First World War. The disintegration of the Russian Empire in 1917 to 1920 with the secession of Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania was followed by an outflow of Finns, Poles, Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians. In 1939 the city has surpassed a 3 million mark. However, the subsequent mobilization to the Winter War, the assignments of some part of both military and civilians onto the western territories of the USSR and to a certain extent, the transfer of some Finns still remaining in Leningrad out of the border zone of the USSR stagnated the 3 million population level through the beginning of the Great Patriotic War in June 1941. The impact of the siege of Leningrad is estimated as one of the longest, most destructive and costly in terms of casualties in human history. Before September 8, 1941, when the city was encircled, 336,000 civilians were evacuated, with the 86 city industrial enterprises that were dismantled and moved to northern Russia and Siberia. From September 1941 through April 1942, 659,000 civilians were evacuated, mainly by watercraft and ice road over the Ladoga Lake. From May through October 1942, another 403,000 people were evacuated, mainly through the waterways of this lake. Not everybody from those 1,298,000 were Leningradians, for some of them fled to the city from surrounding territories seeking a rescue from the German troops. But the worst thing is that many of them died soon after evacuation due to the previous months of starvation within the siege of Leningrad. From September 1941 to January 1944, 670,000 deaths were registered officially, resulting mostly from starvation, stress and exposure. In addition, German shelling and bombings killed 5,723 and wounded 20,507 civilians. Statistics for 1944 show between 546,000 and 700,000 Leningradians who managed to undergo the hardships of the blockade. After the siege was lifted, the evacuees were allowed to return, but the main source of renewal of the population of Leningrad in the post-war years was the influx from other parts of the Soviet Union. Only in 1957, 1958, or 18-19 years after 1939, when the 3 million citizen was born, the city managed to surpass this population mark again. 12 years later, in 1969-1970, the population reached 4 million, and in 1988-1989, 5 million. When the historical maximum was reached in 1990, the whole country has already teetered on the brink of political and economic collapse. The first year when the city has restored its original name, St. Petersburg, was the first in the most lengthy period of the steady population reduction in the city history. By 2003, the city population was less than 4.5 million, or at a level of 1977. Among the reasons of this demographic degradation were the increase of death rate and decrease of birth rate, halting of inflow of workers due to shutdowns of many of the city's industries, increased emigration out of the country, closure of many military educational institutions. At the same time, a certain inflow to the Leningrad Oblast in the 2000s was influenced with the migration from Russia and other ex-Soviet republics, the relocation of officers and the families from places of the overseas deployment of the Soviet Army. The relevant suburban housing construction was supported both with private and state funding. The long-term excess of deaths over births has brought a noticeable population aging. The average age is about 40 years, and people of 65 years and older comprise more than 20% of the population, while the life expectancy in Russia has fallen under 60 years. Periods of temporary economic recovery accompanied by an increase in demand for unskilled labor pose a problem of migrant workers under a new, unexpected angle. In the Soviet-planned economy, this demand was covered by the stable inflow of laborers from the central regions of Russia and the European republics of the USSR. They were favored with both job and dwelling guarantees. Now the labor sourcing geographical azimuth has changed to the ex-republics of Caucasus, Middle Asia and Moldavia, known by the lesser professional skill of newcomers. Apart from that, more and more laborers now migrate to St. Petersburg from the Far East and Turkey. It changes the labor market conditions for people from Russia and other ex-Soviet republics, despite the fact that the latter were taught Russian language from their childhood. Housing. People in urban St. Petersburg mostly live in apartment blocks. Between 1918 and 1990s, the Soviets nationalized housing and many were forced to share their apartments as communal apartments with other residents of the city. In the 1930s, some 68% of the Leningrad population lived in shared apartments. Leningrad was the largest city of the Soviet Union by the number of communarchies, as new boroughs were built on the outskirts in the 1950s-1980s. Over 500,000 low-income families eventually received free apartments, and additional 100,000 condos were purchased by the middle class. While much economic and social activity is still concentrated in and around the city center, which is the richest part of St. Petersburg, the new boroughs has been used mostly as many-storied urban commuter areas. The gentrification has yet to begin, although progress has been made in resettling residents of communarchas in the 1990s. Shared apartments are still not uncommon. In the last 15 years of denationalization, most of residential property has been transferred free of charge, or at a small fraction of its value, to millions of legal residents of St. Petersburg. Illegal immigration is a serious problem.